One of the ideas that guides my own work as a designer and visual journalist is that the visual form of a graphic should depend on its function. It should depend on what you are trying to explain. It should depend on what questions you are trying to answer. If you believe that an infographic is a tool, a piece of technology, you have to make sure that that infographic is something that is adapted to the tasks it is supposed to help with. Let's talk again about unemployment. Let's suppose that you do a graphic on how the jobless rate has changed in the different regions of Spain. Is a map the best way to display this data? To display the change in unemployment rates between September and October? And as a parenthesis, all this data has been made up? Not really. The map doesn't really let you see the details of what areas are doing better or doing worse. It doesn't let you rank. It doesn't allow accurate comparisons. It doesn't let you put those numbers into a proper context. It doesn't allow you to compare them. It just shows the numbers, and that is not enough. But when you encode the same data using a different graphic form, such as a bar chart, for instance, those tasks, comparing, ranking the tasks that I mentioned before, suddenly become much easier. This is what I mean when I say that visual journalists and visual designers should anticipate some of the things our audiences will try to accomplish with our graphics and arrange our graphics accordingly. It's just a quick example of my particular information graphics ethos. For me, any good infographic should be first functional as a hammer. A graphic is, above all, a tool for understanding. So the shape a graphic adopts must depend on the tasks it is intended to help with. A hammer has a particular shape because it has a particular function. You may find plenty of variation in hammers, of course. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller, some of them are yellow, blue, green, heavy or lighter. But at the end, they all share some features that make them look alike. And that's because they are made for a function, hitting stuff. Infographics should be also multi-layered as onions. Good graphics usually offer different ways to approach a story. They offer different layers of information to explore, and they offer different ways to dig into the information and to analyze it. Infographics should also be beautiful, as equations or as good scientific theories, in the sense that they should be efficient. It is true that aesthetic beauty is important in visualization, and I will talk about that in the second lesson, but it is more important to be economical in our displays. We should try to convey complexity by means of forms that are as simple and stripped down as possible. When I have to introduce these ideas to my students, I usually say that the function of a graphic doesn't dictate its form, but the function of a graphic surely does place constraints around the types of forms you can use. All graphics are not created equal. Some work better than others to display specific types of data, or to facilitate certain tasks, as I showed in my previous example about the unemployment rate in Spain. If you want to correctly display information using graphics, you need first to define what your graphic is going to be useful for. What you have on the screen right now is the list of steps that I usually take to complete my own infographics projects. First of all, I define the focus of the story. I define the goals of the graphic, the tasks that graphic should help readers with. Then I do some preliminary research. And then, very important, I choose graphic forms according to step 1, meaning that I choose my graphic forms according to the tasks the infographic should be helpful with. Then I do sketches and storyboards, that would be step 4. Then I complete the research and write the copy, and then I create the graphics, the maps, the diagrams, the illustrations in my computer. But I don't get to steps number 4, 5, and 6 without having completed steps number 1, 2, and 3 first, because those are the crucial steps on any infographics project. Let's see what happens when you go directly to step number 6 without having completed the first steps in this process, meaning that when you go directly to the computer, when you have your data and you go directly to your computer to represent the data without having asked yourself what the graphic is going to be useful for. Choosing graphic forms based just on aesthetic preferences can have serious consequences. See this chart, for instance. I am hiding the values for now. The graphic displays how much each person would save a year if income taxes were reduced by 20%. Some presidential candidates have proposed this measure. If you divide the U.S. population in five groups based on income, called quintiles, the people who will benefit the most are the richest. Those are the ones in the top fifth of the economic ladder, and those are the ones that will save the most. Well, now focus on bubble sizes. If I tell you that the fourth bubble represents around $1,700 a year, could you tell me more or less how much does the fifth bubble represent? Twice that number maybe? 3 times? It is unlikely that you will be able to answer. It actually represents almost 5 times that number. The problem with bubble charts is that they are misleading when it comes to making accurate comparisons. They minimize differences, and they make those differences look much smaller than they really are. The human brain is not good at comparing areas, but just one dimension, width or height. So when you ask readers to compare the areas of two objects, what readers will tend to compare is just their diameters. And the big bubble representing what rich people would save if income taxes were reduced by 20% will appear as much smaller than it really is. So perhaps the bubble chart is not the best way to represent these data. It's not the best way to allow accurate comparisons between the numbers. Notice how striking the differences between the savings of people in the fourth quintile and the fifth quintile are when we represent the same data using a bar chart. It is impressive, isn't it? You cannot notice that huge gap in the bubble chart because bubble charts, as I said before, minimize differences. And the question that may come to your mind right now is probably, are bubble charts always wrong? Well, no, it's wrong. Using a bubble chart is wrong in this particular case because the goal of these graphics seemed to be to allow accurate comparisons. But, using bubble chart or not depends on what the tasks your graphic should help with. Take a look, for instance, at this 2004 elections map made by the New York Times. It uses bubbles appropriately. This kind of display is called a proportional symbol map in cartography. Its goal is not to let you accurately compare the bubble of New York City with the bubble of Austin or with the bubble of Miami or with the one in Los Angeles. The goal of the graphic is to give you an idea of the overall pattern of spread and clustering of Democratic and Republican vote in the U.S. So going back to the steps I usually take to complete any graphic, we could say that different tasks require different graphic forms. First, you need to define what your graphic should be useful for. Don't forget that a graphic is a tool. And then, based on that, you can choose the most appropriate forms to encode your data. A question that I would like to address now is if it's possible to rationally decide what forms are more appropriate for each story or for each set of data. I must admit that there are no strict standards, but there are certain authors who have proposed some guidelines that can help you make informed decisions. 2 of those authors are William Cleveland and Robert McGill. In the 80s, they wrote a paper called Graphical Perception, Theory, Experimentation, and Application to the Development of Graphical Methods, and in that paper, they proposed a scale of methods for encoding data. It's actually a scale. The higher a graphic form is in this hierarchy, the more accurate the judgments it allows. If a method of encoding data is low in the scale, it won't allow precise judgments, but it may be useful for identifying generic trends and patterns, as we saw in the proportional symbol map from the New York Times. Bringing this idea to the real world, a bar chart is almost in every case better than an area chart or one based on shades of color if your goal is to let readers compare and rank a list of figures. Notice how it is easier to compare the bars than to compare the bubbles or the color rectangles below. That said, you should not forget that depending on the space that you have for your graphic, you can represent the same data more than once. You may want to give readers the opportunity to answer different questions, and a single graphic form may not be enough for that. Let me give you an example of what I am saying. In 2010, before moving back to the US to teach infographics and visualization at the University of Miami, I was the director of infographics for a Brazilian news publication called Época. Época is a weekly print magazine that also has a strong presence in the internet. It regularly publishes visualizations and graphics on the web. And what you have on the screen right now is just an example of that. This is a graphic that shows how the population of the world has changed since 1950 until 2010, and it also shows you how the population will change in the future. The graphic is based on data from the United Nations. The first thing that you will see when you visit the graphic is a bubble chart, is a bubble map, a proportional symbol map. Each one of those bubbles represents the population of each one of those countries in a particular year. But if you move a slider, there is a slider over here, if you move it to the left or to the right, you can see how the bubbles change. That represents the changes in population in each one of those countries. But as I mentioned before, a bubble chart is good at letting you see the big picture. All right, letting you see trends and patterns in the data, but it is not very good at letting you make accurate comparisons. It's not very good at letting you see the ranking of countries according to their population. So those are other questions, those are other needs readers may feel when they see a graphic like this. So you have to address that. How would you do that? Well, representing the data not just through a bubble chart, but also through other visualization forms, other graphic forms. And you can see that in this graphic. If you click on this link over here, ranking, that's exactly what you will get. This is the same data represented through a table. All right, and you can also move the slider to the left or to the right to see how the ranking of countries has changed throughout the years. So far, we have seen two different ways of representing the same data for, addressing different questions, for letting readers answer different questions. But the graphic represents the data in a third way, through a third graphic form. Let's go back to the map. Let's suppose that, and this is something that some readers will try to do, let's suppose that you want to see how the population of a particular country has changed throughout the years. You can try to do that in the bubble map, through the bubble map, if you move the slider to the left or to the right, but this is not very efficient because it's really difficult to tell the difference between the bubble of 2010 and the bubble of 2011. It's really, really hard to notice significant differences between those two bubbles. So we try to address that. We try to anticipate what our readers would try to do with the graphic. So if a reader is interested in seeing how the population of a country has changed, let's say the US, for instance, you want to see how the US has changed throughout the years, you can click on the bubble and you will get this floating window, this pop-up window that will allow you to see the data represented in a line chart. So you can see how the trend on population growth has changed throughout the years. You can roll over each one of the years and get the specifics. And moreover, you can also compare the US with other countries. You can open this drop-down menu and go down here and compare the US with, I don't know, maybe Nigeria, All right, so that's the US compared to Nigeria. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this short explanation, if you have enough space, you should not feel constrained by a single graphic form. You should feel free to represent the same data using different graphic forms that will allow readers to answer different kinds of questions.